16 years now, and then focusing in the security realm for the last 11 years. So, with partners most of that time. Been with Cache Valley for almost 7 years now, so it's been a great place to work. And I represent a full team of network security engineers here local to us here in Utah. So, yeah, that I wanted to get you guys excited and engaged on multi-factor authentication. To do that, put a little agenda together. First, we'll focus in on kind of what all MFA is about, the why and the how, and then we'll jump into how Duo will make it a great experience for your users to be able to adopt it fully and actually have some strong MFA in place that's easy to deploy, manage, and enjoyable for your users. So here's a brief agenda for that. We'll go through how we can create less user friction with SSO and passwordless proximity verification and risk-based authentication. And then I wanted to announce, if you don't know already, that Duo is a complete security-first IAM. That's more of a newer feature, that Duo is now a full-blown directory and can be a user directory for you, not just have to integrate with other directories. So we'll get into that with the Duo directory, and then routing rules for multiple user directories in case you have other directories already that you want to integrate with. And last but not least, Active Directory has been around for a very long time. It's, something that's very valuable and critical to a lot of companies today and organizations. So being able to protect that in today's modern world where everything is kind of evolving fast, heading to the cloud, being able to protect AD has been critical for a lot of orgs that are still utilizing that, and many still do today. So I'm going to give you a little preview of Duo's new feature that's about to come out of Duo Active Directory Defense. And then at the end, I'm going to show you what you can get today for free by hooking in and getting a free identity security assessment if you want. And everything you see today is available through the state's NASPO contract. So let's get started. MFA Essentials, the why and the how. So based on some data with Cisco Talos, Cisco's Security Intelligence and Threat Research Group, and they also have an incident response group as part of that. So they handle incidents that happen with customers that have that service. They collected some of the data from what they were responding to back just a couple of years ago, and they determined that 80% of breaches leveraged identity as a key component, which is a huge number. So identity is a prime target, and 66% of initial access cases involved valid accounts. And also 40% of compromises included misconfigured MFA or no MFA or MFA bypass. So those are some big numbers to take in perspective. So why, with all that data backing this up, why does it seem so difficult to secure identity? And one point is attackers have evolved over time to be able to attack identity in a more efficient manner. You have your regular application logins, and usually it was username and password based back when applications came around a time ago. Username and password, something the user knows, and that's where the attacks would come in initially. With these applications that started out many years ago, and so focusing on the password, we were able to combat that by helping users adopt strong passwords, put in complexity requirements, and add MFA, and hopefully that takes care of it, right? So that was good enough in the past, but today, now we see that adversaries are actually roaming across these different attack vectors. We've got the enrollment flow, where attacker will attempt a brute force of password spray for new employees. Attackers now expect MFA to be in place, so they'll attempt an MFA bypass, either at the operating system level or the application login level. That attacker has physical access to the device. They're going to try and get an operating system since they are there locally with the machine. And then the attacker will attempt to fall back to less secure MFA methods on applications that support multiple MFA authentication methods. Another more complex, but still is happening, is in the middle of a session, attackers will attempt to steal session cookies and replay those cookies to get access to that same map with that authentication source. And last, but definitely not least, and definitely one that is hit upon in today's world, is using social engineering tactics with the help of deep fake AI, making that a lot easier to accomplish. An attacker will attempt to social engineer help desk into getting them a valid credential and MFA enrollment flow for that attacker needs to begin. All that, another point is with traditional identity access management, security is not priority. And perhaps this will put it in a little bit of perspective and might be familiar where we have multiple identity providers. Perhaps you have Active Directory legacy, and then you have Entra ID now that Microsoft offers that cloud identity for you. Perhaps you're using a third identity if you're using like Google Apps and have Google Workspace as well. You know, we've got these different identity providers across the board. And then perhaps you set up a separate contractor identity provider for partners and outside vendors, parties that need access to your systems to help support you. And as part of all those identity providers, you've got dormant and orphan accounts that are kind of hiding in the back. But usually what you're dealing with is you can only see from one identity provider's perspective. So individually, you only get visibility on accounts that exist just in that identity provider, and perhaps the dormant and orphan accounts that are existing on just that identity provider. Another contributor to this is users are constantly being hammered on when they have to log in and have to go through those hoops to get authenticated and identified. You know, first at the computer login, and then next thing to log into is the web browser app. And then perhaps they launch the Outlook client or some other application on their computer. They have to log in again. And maybe they're accessing a resource that requires a VPN connection. If it's not web-based, usually we're looking at a VPN connection to get access to that system or service. So now they have to log in again for VPN. If they switch across browsers, they don't get that same authenticated session cookie intact. So now they're having to re-authenticate on a whole separate browser just to get that cookie created again. One quote here, I should be able to log into my work machine once and then not have to sign into 8 different applications. That would be the ideal experience from a user standpoint. The problem is now that we have this resistance and all these hoops to jump through, user frustration also turns into admin frustration because now the admins are getting the calls. That's because it gets the calls on how to help user get through these more challenging, more difficult ways to get authenticated and get into the system they're trying to access. So just to dig a little deeper on why traditional IAM has failed to protect identity, we believe that traditional IAM or identity providers and access management providers have failed to protect identity. They were built for another era and they were built for identity management, not really focused on identity security. So first, they give us a false sense of security. The security controls that were built in or bolted on are now outdated. So they're not taking into account the expanding identity attack surface that we just went through, the rise of MFA bypass, and the new threat of AI, which gives attackers a simple way to scale impactful attacks. Second, traditional IAM is complex and costly. Sometimes they consolidate everything into a single tool for you, but in that way it's often clunky or it doesn't work very well, or they charge you a lot extra for security. Have any of you been supporting an application for your org that you want to enable SSO? You have to buy an add-on or a premium tier to that application. You ever heard of SSO tax? Because that's what it's called. There's a whole Reddit forum on SSO tax. You can go find it in all the complaints. And yeah, it's true across many vendors and their applications. They're going to charge you more to be able to get easier and more secure authentication happening with SSO support. And then third, the traditional IAMs are siloed and blind. So what we mean here is identity is complicated. So there are a lot of different pieces, and all the providers out there only look into their own sandbox, so their own ecosystem, and they lack comprehensive visibility. They have limited insight into what's going on in other tools, so they can't understand the security posture overall, and they can't react to threats quickly and efficiently. And then, as we touched on just before, frustrate the users, and that frustrates IT and security professionals as a result with that. All right, so now that we kind of know the why, let's get into the how. And I just wanted to break this down to basics to start off real quick. Multi-factor authentication is the practice of adding multiple unique authentication methods to user identity verification at login. So what does MFA really look like in practice? You know, we get to choose from some different options, but which ones are the best? First, one option is what the user knows. That's been traditionally what we've been using in the past. The user knows a password to get logged in. There's some pros and cons to that. You know, it's inexpensive, easy to set up, easy to maintain, but you know, you get the cons of user frustration when they forget their password, or you know, if they write it down somewhere, hide it under their keyboard, potentially get stolen and used in a malicious manner, or you know, being impersonated by another person and you can't keep track of things that way. Another option is what the user has, so using actual physical tokens or fobs, or similar to bank cards, government IDs. In today's modern world, we're using 502 security keys for what the user has in their possession. And this is actually one of the safest methods. And so when you try and do good MFA, we're trying to incorporate at least something that the user has. But again, especially if you're doing like hardware tokens, they can be small, difficult to keep track of, damaged, difficult to replace. And then another option you have is who the user is. So biometrics, so fingerprint scanning, voice recognition, facial recognition, those things. Again, this is one of the safest MFA methods because it's something that finds who that person is and is with them. Can't be easily replicated. Even with AI, it still is a pretty heavy requirement to really truly replicate that, but it can be done, but it's just a lot harder. And then where the user is, so things like IP address, geographic location. Problem with that one is, you may have some concerns with your employees about their privacy if they're being tracked constantly. How do we do that in a manner that won't intrude on a person's privacy and make them feel comfortable while keeping them safe? So usually multi-factor, is a combination of at least two or more of these. And that's the basics of MFA. Any questions about how MFA works at a ground level? So what I want to move into is how to make MFA great experience for the user and also for you guys as administrators and supporters of those solutions. So let's take a look at how Duo specifically, the why and the how Duo does it differently with the true single sign-on experience. So imagine in the past, we've had things separated out. Perhaps the user has a password for this app, a different password for that app, because everything's tied to that one application. Sometimes you get it to the point where they're using the same username and password, but they still have to provide it individually to each application. But you also have this problem of policies being spread out across and siloed in each of those applications. Perhaps there's some MFA going on here to get into the more sensitive HR application that you're using, like Workday, whereas Google Workspace, as long as they have a valid employee credential there, there's not much more policy in that space. And then it differs, a lot differently as you go along to your different apps. So we took a step forward and said, all right, well, let's get the back end of these apps at least talking to a centralized management solution or centralized identity solution. And so protocols such as Radius and LDAP help bridge that gap to say, okay, let's get us connected into Active Directory or some other store that supports those protocols on the back end. And that way the user can use that same username and password. But again, they still have to use it separately in each app. They don't get to take their authenticated session from one app to another one. So is that truly single sign-on? Yeah, just keep going here. So is it single sign if you have to log in again with each browser? We say no, not in our opinion. So bringing in an awesome feature of Duo called Duo Passport. So the way it kind of works is, the user log into their machine, they pop open their first browser. Here's the point where they're triggered, to actually authenticate and do whatever policy you've got in place, do those extra checks, do a full multi-factor authentication. And then after that point, whatever they launch after that, they don't have to authenticate again. That authentication just gets automatically sent over to the other application or the other browser. So if they launch a second browser, authentication is happening again, but it's all happening transparently to the user on the back end through the device, Duo in the cloud, and the Duo desktop app that's on the machine. So that way they can get on to their apps in their second browser without having to be hit with authentication again. If they're logging into some other service that requires MFA, boom, they're in again without having to provide their username and password or MFA. And then any other SSO enabled apps that you have, for your intranet, what the users are using for to get their Office 365 apps, their email, whatever. That way, that's all just happened that one time, it can be shared, and you don't have to do it again, and it's all done securely because of everything that's loaded there with Duo. But wouldn't it be cool if we could go from authenticating the one time at the browser and move that back to the operating system login? Because that is actually feasible with Duo today. But first, I wanted to look at a whole flow, just starting with the browser example. So the way it works under the hood is Duo Desktop will send a signed user and device profile to the Duo Cloud, and Duo Cloud will record that profile for that user. So when they open up that app that they're getting into for the first time, so in Chrome, they launch their browser to get into their work app. Now, they see the Duo universal prompt prompting them to log in. Duo will request a fresh user and device profile from the device they're accessing it from. And then Duo Desktop sends an updated profile to that cloud. And Duo will do that match of saying, okay, does the new profile match the original profile? And if so, Duo will issue a new session for that application, and then they're in. Now, let's say they're launching a different app. So they're launching Firefox now instead of Chrome. And in the same flow, user accesses that Duo protected app via second browser. Duo requests another user and device profile from the device, which gets sent from Duo Desktop back to the cloud. And Duo Cloud is doing that match one more time. And Duo Cloud will issue a new session cookie for that application and get them logged into that second app, that second browser, and they're off and running without the user having to even put in their username. This all happens on the back end. It gets them logged in securely. Signing in once with our password in this flow. But what if we went to a world where there weren't any passwords? Do any of you ask, how is passwordless MFA? Because now we're taking out something that the user knows. So how has passwordless actually become MFA? It turns into something that the user has through use of 502 security keys that are created and loaded onto the hardware of the user's workstation. Again, this is one of the safest methods to be using that. So in both cases, we're using something the user has. And then to unlock that key, because it's encrypted on the hardware, we use something either who the user is through a fingerprint scanner, if they have a fingerprint scanner on their machine, or through facial recognition with the camera, if the hardware supports that. But if the hardware doesn't support that, or you want to add a different option, you can also use a shorter pin to protect that file that's encrypted on the hardware itself. So it's a lot easier for users to remember a shorter pin than some lengthy, crazy, complex password, right? So that's the whole idea here, is to make it a lot less user friction, but we're still getting full MFA because it is something that the user has, as well as either who they are, what they know with that little pin. Obviously, we prefer to be in the realm of who the user is, but there are use cases where you don't have the hardware right here on the machine they're logging into to do either a fingerprint scanner or facial recognition. So with Duo, we can actually support true passwordless because usually when you're setting up passwordless, even as you're logging into, perhaps you're going Amazon shopping or into your email at home and for your personal apps, you'll notice that they're now starting to prompt you to create a passkey, right? create a passkey, that's where you're actually enrolling into passwordless for that particular app. But they still will offer you, sign in another way. You still can use your password like you were using before as an option usually, or they use that as a fallback, at least in case your passkey, you change devices, you lose that passkey because again, passwordless is sticking with that device you used to have. So most of those solutions are still kind of dependent on that password being in place for fallback and bootstrapping, doing that initial enrollment. Whereas Duo passwordless, you can start it right fresh out of the gate if you want to and be 100% passwordless from the get-go. So here's how that would kind of look if you wanted to go just base. We're starting out with Duo fresh. We want to get user enrolled for passwordless. You as an admin will see the Duo admin panel here. Perhaps you have your users already defined in an external system like Okta or Entra. You can synchronize those user accounts in just for their username. And then after you verify the user's identity, you can give them an enrollment code along with that enrollment URL. So they click on that URL on their own machine. They log in with their email address, their enrollment code that you just gave them after verifying their identity. And then Duo will give them that enrollment flow to get them set up with passwordless. In this case, they're using biometric with the fingerprint scanner. So now they have their passwordless options set up. And now if you have like an intranet portal, SSO portal that users can land on, if you don't have one, Duo has one built in that you can enable if you so choose. They'll go hit that portal or whatever SSO application you have figured, be prompted for their passwordless authentication. And once they provide their fingerprint like they did before, they're in. If you would rather not be so involved on the admin side because having to verify them is taxing for an admin and giving them an enrollment code. If you do have that external identity directory already set up, you can sync them in and you can have Duo point over to that directory for authentication for that first step. So they can use their typical username and password that they're used to using to get them enrolled passwordless on the Duo side. This is an example of kind of how that happens. So maybe they're accessing your intranet or whatever SSO app, and then you can configure that SSO app to enroll for passwordless, but we're going to use your identity provider. In this case, it's Okta. They use their username and their password that they already have and know. And after they get past that hurdle, then Duo will go through the passwordless enrollment just like before. So from here on out, it's very similar. They're going to enroll their Touch ID, get your passkeys set up and installed on physical hardware. Of course, to do that, to get it, physically on that workstation, it needs to be, kind of some recent hardware that has that TPM module, or Mac will support it with the security enclave chip if it's a recent build. So the challenge with passwordless is a protocol called WebAuthn is required to be able to support passwordless. And those embedded browsers that pop up on the apps don't always support that protocol to be able to allow you to do passwordless. So again, Duo has done some great work here to bring in the Duo desktop app that can actually bridge that gap for your users on their machine. So as you're launching these different apps that launch those embedded browsers, the Duo desktop app can actually facilitate a passwordless experience for those users as they're moving across apps and moving across browsers. Duo also supports passwordless with third-party IDPs using protocols like LDAP, Entra ID, OpenID Connect, and SAML 2.0. In these cases, where you're not always necessarily given like the Duo universal prompt to do a passwordless experience, as long as the user is willing to load up the Duo mobile app on their phone or the corporate phone that you give them, if you do so, then they can use that as their passwordless option and just, have them do a push, accept, or deny to get the passwordless experience going for those older legacy protocols. So if we remove passwords, like we talked about, force TPM crypto binding, which is a local machine setting you can enforce to keep that hardware chips secured with those passkeys intact. And if we focus on eliminating phishing and credential theft on the side, are we done? It's all great, but there's still this problem with cookies. Cookie gets compromised after the session gets created. We could get an attacker, but reusing that cookie to get in. So this is kind of a quick flow of what kind of is a realistic threat out there in the wild today. Perhaps an employee gets a phishing email, they follow that link, it looks like a legitimate Microsoft 365 login screen. So they log into that Office app. Because everything is happening in the middle with this adversary in the middle web server sitting there, they'll still pass along everything to the legitimate service. So it actually does look and feel like the user's experience logging in to Office 365. So they'll get the push like they normally do with MFA, they accept it, and then that creates the session token, which gets captured in this particular attack by that web server sitting in the middle, evil genius. And then after that, bad guy can use that cookie to access Office, so he's bypassing those MFA protections. So with Duo Passport, it uses the strong device binding to be able to match things up, and Duo can remove the session cookies from that experience, because as we're using refresh tokens, we can actually set that lifetime to be a lot shorter, so that way that cookie just becomes null and void in a shorter amount of time with that adversary trying to reuse it. So Duo is very, very focused as a security first identity provider to think through all these possibilities and really work hard to make it easy and built in from the get-go. So we're almost a true SSO, but again, like I teased earlier, there's that extra sign into the operating system. So what would passwordless OS login look like? So for the first time that user logs into the machine, in this case, we're calling Lee. Lee will enter his username and password as normal, and then is prompted to register by Duo. So his passwordless authentication. That key pair, passkey, is created and stored in that TPM module. The password is also encrypted as part of that process. We're actually leveraging Bluetooth a little bit here too. That the workstation will advertise that Bluetooth low energy signal, and then Lee will get prompted on the Duo mobile app when he's using it the first time to accept those permissions to allow Bluetooth access for Duo mobile, and then that way Duo mobile can actually start reading that Bluetooth signal from the workstation. So we now know that the device and the phone are close to each other enough for Bluetooth to be connecting up. We trigger a biometric push from Duo to Lee, and he'll complete that. So it's a very strong level of assurance with that authentication method to be doing a biometric push just to get him enrolled. Now the encrypted password is sent through Duo Cloud back to the Duo mobile app on the phone, and now Lee is registered and completes the login to the workstation for the first time. From that point on, now that he's registered in, now there's no password prompt. He just clicks sign in, and this all happens rather quickly too. The Bluetooth signal gets sent out, gets picked up by Duo Mobile, and then Lee again does a quick biometric push, Face ID, and then Bluetooth actually shares the code on the back end, so the user doesn't have to type in anything. The encrypted password is sent from Duo Mobile through Duo Cloud to the operating system, and then the Duo Cred provider service that's loaded on the machine decrypts that password and auto logs in Lee. So Lee logs in, and the session is established at that point. It's access to the machine. Pretty slick, but you may say, well, having to connect up to Duo Cloud and be on the internet, right, to make this all work. So naturally, Duo's thought about that as well. We've got some offline authentication methods. We've done a lot of deployments securing Windows login and RDP login for Windows machines and servers for our customers. That's one of the most popular and highly demanded integrations of Duo. And obviously they've worked out a lot of the kinks with that as well to be able to support some offline options in case internet access is not available to that machine. So we've got one-time password with the Duo mobile app. They can type that in from their phone that they have. Or if you're working with a Windows specific endpoint, you could have those hardware security keys as an option that they plug in USB. And they just tap and now you're in. So to kind of support, the Duo protected operating system login, here's what's currently supported today. We've got Windows supporting local logins, online, offline. If it's an RDP session coming into that particular machine, that's supported. And we can also do a Duo MFA prompt for user account control and support that passwordless login that I was just showcasing to you. Mac, we do have support for adding MFA with Duo for local logins, and if it's online or offline, offline is also supported there. With Linux, again, we can do some MFA to get logged into the machine locally. It does rely on an online experience though for that particular operating system, but bonus, SSH is also supported to trigger MFA and secure that protocol on Linux machines. So what does this really all look together start to finish? Putting it all together on the Windows machine, this one goes pretty fast. Let's see if I can keep up with it. So we will click sign in, gets prompted, Bluetooth ensures he's nearby, it's let me on. And every app launched from this point, so first to launch Chrome, didn't have to type in his username or password because he just logged in with the operating system. And then opening Outlook, you could have done this first before the browser. It's just automatically logging in quickly with everything in place that we just went through.
That's really fast.
Yep. There's a resource that they're trying to connect to that isn't available over standard web. Like this one's over port 8443. That'll trigger VPN authentication. And then using the VPN client, as long as you have support for SAML authentication, Duo can support that layer of being authentication for your VPN connections. And then now we're in Edge. We're in a different browser already, logging into the same applications or other applications that are used in that browser without ever the user having to be prompted for even a username. I'm logged in. All just because they logged in with MFA to their operating system.
So that looks good in the recording. Bill, Corey, you guys work for the mothership. You work for Cisco. How often do you put in a password?
A few times a day. And it depends on the applications, right? So Outlook will time out differently from, say, my web-based apps. And so I'll get a different, it's not too bad. It's worse on the phones, but that's the way Cisco's implemented internally. It's not the product's fault.
Yeah. Obviously, this is a utopia that isn't going to work for every single use case, but it is achievable today if the use case lines up and you have the right support with hardware. That jazz. But that would obviously be the ideal world for me as a user logging into things. I like to log into my machine once with the MFA, and now I can just launch all the applications I use, where all that magic's kind of happening with Duo to keep me securely authenticated to those apps.
I have really recently they've been able to pass keys. And so I can use my fingerprint on my Mac and it just goes with passkey. And I actually use Dashlane. It's where I store my passkeys. So it actually goes and checks with Dashlane and all the different things.
How does that work with admin overrides?
Admin overrides.
Like if you have the single sign-on, but then they can't install it for themselves, so an admin UIC admin prompt pops up.
Yeah.
Admin signs in. If they're not local, if they're not sitting there at the PC, sit back in the office doing this remotely,
Right.
what is it going to do?
So like the admin is not there locally at the machine.
Yeah. So like So we use like Dameware, for example, to visually see the PC from wherever they're at, right? So we're just using their menu to connect to it, so we can see their desktop. And so if they're saying, hey, I need to install this thing, so we put in our get the UAC prompt to get that admin approval. But if we have single sign-on here, what's it going to do? Is it going to be prompting for a username and password? Is it going to be?
Well, yeah, like it'll first, attempt to log in with their credential if it's all loaded up on their local machine. But if, you need to use your credential instead, you'll be doing your credential on that prompt. And then depending on how the policy is configured is what's going to be allowed in that situation. So like if you're not doing the proximity verification portion of it, but you're allowing, the prompt to come through to your machine, and since you can see the code on screen or whatever, if you're using more of a verified push is what Duo calls it, where you're doing the number matching on screen with what you're typing on the phone. Okay. You have that option.
So the proximity thing with Bluetooth, that's an optional thing.
Yes.
It doesn't have to be. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think for doing it from operating system login to be able to share that to the other apps locally on the machine, that needs to have the proximity verification. But if you're just triggering kind of these one-off situations where it's a different authentication flow for a privileged user account, that's handled a little differently because you're not using the credential from the operating system. You're using a separate credential and identity from that. So it's going to trigger a different flow. Yeah, that's a great question. All right, that was my longest section. So sorry, thanks for hanging out through that one. These other ones are shorter. I just wanted to look a little bit closer at that proximity verification because this is something that Duo is doing that I haven't seen other MFA providers offer. So the reason this came about is, we want to achieve end-to-end phishing resistance. Phishing is very prevalent today with emails coming in. AI has made it really easy to replicate legitimate looking web login screens. So what are we really looking at here? Obviously MFA bypass, because attackers now expect MFA. They have a variety of mechanisms to bypass it. They're focused on both the operating system and application logins. So one way to solve that's been highly adopted, especially in like say DoD environments and other heavy regulated environments, they'll use either the PIV CAC option. They'll use cards that plug into like a USB reader or a built-in reader to gain access to that machine. FIDO2 is a standard that's used for doing those hardware-based keys, or a whole separate physical hardware token is another option that a lot of customers that have these heavy requirements have adopted. So, they'll plug in that hardware key via USB, and then they're kind of chained to that to log into everything throughout the day. So, kind of looking at the whole experience here, the user experience. The security is actually really strong here because again, we're involving something that the user has in their possession, right? By leveraging all these three options. But the user experience isn't the best. It's okay. It's reasonable enough to accept. If I have to use my key, have it with me all the time to plug in and get on there, or to always be authenticating from this particular device, that's not too big of a deal for a user. But on the admin side, it's kind of taxing to be managing all these things that the users have in their possession, especially for doing, security cards or security tokens that they have physically. You have to manage and make sure those are all imported into the MFA systems as authorized and matched up to that user that's logging in. So, option that Duo came out with is proximity verification. So that Bluetooth, check will actually ensure that access and authentication device are both physically close to each other. So that way it can't be spoofed by some attacker unless they're sitting in your lap, right? So you really need to identify that. So again, because we're leveraging something that the the user has a cell phone, mobile phone, has Bluetooth, and doing that extra check of making sure they're close to each other. You know, we're not having to give them something new. They have that phone already. The security is high because, again, it's something they have. The user experience is nice because now they don't have to carry around a second hardware piece of whatever to get authenticated in. And the admins don't have to keep track of all these serial numbers of hardware keys that they have to keep track of and mapped correctly. And then if it gets replaced, they have to go and update that. So admin experience is really improved too. What it kind of looks like, you know, if the user's at their machine, they have their phone nearby as they're logging in to do a protected applications with MFA. They'll get the prompt here. They'll check to see if they're nearby using the Bluetooth signal. It says you're nearby, yep, they can approve it. That way we can verify legitimate user access and the auth device are near to each other. And you don't have to have hardware security keys roaming around and keeping track of all those. So it nullifies those remote access attacks. You know, there are attacks like SIM swap that are still, you know, legitimate ways of adversaries being able to attack your identity authentications. There's push bombing, just lots of pushes coming through. Adversary in the middle, like I highlighted earlier. But in all those instances, they're remote. They're away from the user's access device. Yep. That's basically said everything I wanted to on that one, I guess. Yeah, so yeah, the other benefit, again, like if you're not having to buy security keys and keep track of all those, and then the way that Duo's interface makes it a lot more simpler as well to configure those policies and those MFA factors. You can actually realize some true cost savings there by reusing what you have in place rather than going to that extra effort to buy something extra and bolt it on top of what you're traditionally using. You just turn it on and it's not really that hard to turn on. It's just a few clicks to adjust policies and apply them where you need them to be. So here's what a large telecommunications customer said. Stronger MFA is a security requirement, and we were struggling with the friction to roll it out more widely. Proximity verification using Bluetooth made it very intuitive, and our colleagues are loving it. It's our most used authentication method today, and it's always good to see a feature like this which balances security well with ease of use. So that's proximity verification in a nutshell. Last, to make the user experience, you know, really enjoyable is we've got, you know, the differing levels of authentication methods. You know, we're trying to stay away from these ones below the line. They're kind of dangerous, easily spoofed, easily taken advantage of. Passwords, obviously, SMS text messages, phone calls, getting out of that realm to be, you know, giving us more assurance that we are identifying that user is who they are. We enter the realm of a push on an app, or, you know, soft tokens like one-time passwords, or tokens that are installed locally on the machine with just on the software side. Number matching takes it up a notch, where we're actually seeing a number on screen, typing that into the phone. There's even support out there for some wearables, so the user might get a notification on their watch, and they just type in whatever they want it to be, and then they accept the prompt on their wearable. Makes it nice and easy for users sometimes. And then obviously the highest level of assurance is doing something where we're incorporating something of who the user is with biometrics, physical security key that they have, or a biometric push on their mobile device. So cool thing about Duo is you can tailor each of these options based on what app you're trying to support. If it's a legacy solution that you're trying to support that doesn't necessarily allow you to go up as high, you can still configure policy to allow that in that particular use case. So it's really flexible here. But with risk-based authentication, instead of having, let's say you've locked down your critical work app, your HR, finance, your CRM or whatever application you're using to make your business profitable. You could come in and set policy to be like, you know what, we need to make sure they're using some sort of 502 compliant authentication method with either a hardware key or a pass key that's loaded on that machine. And they have to fingerprint every single time to get into that application. Well, if the user context and device context aren't changing at all, so if it's the same user coming in from the same device, from the same location, without any suspicious behavior happening, why would we send them through that difficult hoop every single time they're logging into that application? We can actually help out that user experiencing by stepping up to that level the first time, and then anytime that user context or device context changes, whether suspicious activity is detected, like in this case, a push phishing attack pattern where they're getting push after push after push for that particular user account. That's when, rather than going from maybe no re-authentication required, at that point, we come down and we ensure that they do a more higher level of assurance authentication method by making them do the number matching with a verified duo push here. So that way you can thwart the attackers that are triggering that malicious behavior. But if the user is just coming to that same app day after day after day, after they've done it the first time to get, after they've done the really difficult hoops to jump through with their MFA, we can relax that as they're coming back repeatedly from the same location on the same device. And some of the signals that play into that, when do we step it up? When do we notice that the context has changed or behavior has changed to make it suspicious, so we can step it up to that higher level of authentication methods for multi-factor. Duo uses things like the user marked it as fraud on their push. They have that option. If they decline it, they can also mark it as fraud. There's anomalous and suspicious activity that's detected by the system on the back end, repeated authentication failures, a push spray. So an attacker might send pushes across multiple users in your org, or push harassment where they're targeting one user, push after push after push. If unrealistic travel is detected, so if a user appears to authenticate from a new location that would be impossible to reach based on the past authentication location and the timing of that past one. If there's a country code mismatch, so say the authentication device and the access device appear to be in two different countries, that would trigger a known attack pattern signal. And then novel ASN, so authentication from an ASN not seen in recent history of successful authentications for the organization as a whole. And then device distance, the authentication device and the access device are abnormally far apart. So those are some of the signals, just to kind of get deep in the weeds, just kind of show you what's really happening down at the ground level. Thing that Duo does, they have a patent pending on this that's kind of unique to them, is they'll use the risk signal of a Wi-Fi fingerprint from the endpoint. So with Duo Desktop on Windows, Mac, or Linux access devices, Duo has this Wi-Fi fingerprint technology that can evaluate a change in location through anonymized network data and protects employee privacy by leveraging this contextual signal instead of GPS to determine the user's geolocation. So this allows us to know that a user has moved without really having to know exactly where they are. So that way you maintain the privacy of that user. So as a wrap up to everything I just went through, creating less user friction with all those features of Duo was frustrating the attackers, not the users, enabling your users to be more happy to adopt a strong MFA in your environment. All right. So I wanted to zip through the Duo directory. So with Duo being an actual full-blown identity directory for you, if you want to leverage that part of it. As in the past, Duo wasn't really able to operate as an independent directory. You're always hooking it into either Active Directory or Entra or Google, synchronizing those users in. And then all the passwords live over in whatever you synced it from. There weren't any passwords in Duo. That's now changed. You can now set up user accounts directly in Duo, start it out fresh as a Duo user account. And if you want, you can incorporate Duo passwords for those users locally on Duo. Again, it'd be nice to go to passwordless like we showcased at the beginning, which is an option you can do with Duo as your sole or primary identity provider. So 3 options you have with Duo acting as a directory. The first one is, you can have Duo just be your standalone identity directory and identity access management solution. If you were starting out fresh today, that would be an option, or perhaps you want to just migrate off and have Duo be your one and only. So that way, if they're employees, partners, vendors, contractors, whoever, if they're getting to one of your apps, their account lives and breathes on Duo. And you get all the benefits of the security that Duo provides for authentications coming in there. As a different option, which we see a little bit more right now with their customers, just because they've adopted other identity stores like Entra or Directory. Perhaps you have Entra hooked into your SaaS apps. You might have a different provider for identity hooked in your cloud apps. Could be Okta, could be Google. Maybe you have Ping protecting your on-prem apps, and then AD's protecting your legacy apps that are running over NTLM and Kerberos and those protocols. Or kind of my favorite option to pitch would be, you have Active Directory plus maybe Entra ID because you've started that migration path with Microsoft licensing or whatever. You're still keeping your Microsoft identity provider for your employees, but you transition your contractors, vendors, and partners off of it onto Duo. So their account only lives on Duo to access all your apps. And that way, all you're paying for is the Duo user license. You don't have to pay for a Microsoft 365 account anymore for that user to be able to log in and support whatever items they're supporting in your org. So if they deploy hardware solutions where they're logging in, maybe they're VPNing in to support that solution for you. If they're able to log in that solution without an Active Directory account, then there's really no need for them to have an account on your standard internal identity provider. So that option. So perhaps you've got more than one identity provider that you're dealing with. Duo's routing rules enable you to be able to connect in. Oh, one last thing I wanted to talk about with this option is, they can bring their own email address. So you don't have to provision them in a mailbox anymore if their account lives and breathes on Duo. If they need to do like a password reset or something like that with their Duo account, it goes to their work email address that they're using, which is outside your domain. So really nice from my perspective. So yeah, if you're still got Active Directory kicking around, you're using Entra ID on the cloud side, maybe you've got some Google apps, maybe you got some developers that are hooked into AWS. Duo can actually act as a hub for your authentication. So once that authentication comes into Duo, based on where the user's coming from or what application they're accessing, Duo can route it to the right identity store. So that takes out all the heavy lift on your end to make sure that particular application is hooked into the right identity store on the back end. You can actually make it a lot more flexible by fronting Duo in front of it. What that kind of looks like from the admin console and actually configuring it. You get these options, which application are they connecting into? It's destined for a specific application. You can create a rule for that. And then if that user is coming from one of your domains, or maybe it's from one of your partner domains, you can decide, okay, we're going to send it over to the partner's identity provider instead. And then wherever they're coming from, if you want to handle things differently based on the source network into that application, we can then pick a different destination of where that authentication, that username and password is going to be authenticated against. So once you get those rules built out, it could kind of look something like this, where you have external contractors that are coming into your systems when they're hitting these particular applications. They're going to hit Duo where that user account lives. Whereas your standard employees, when they're accessing your internal apps, that'll be authenticated against Active Directory. So we understand people, they already have Active Directory, they already have Entra, they already have Okta sometimes, but a real pain point for many customers is that third-party access or contractor access, because you want to manage all that in the same directory where your employees live, but sometimes you don't do it, or it's just complicated to do so. So it's a really great use case to be able to bring in Duo and route it to where it needs to go. All right, last but not least, focusing in on Active Directory, a very sensitive yet critical application if it's still in use in your environment. To give you a preview of Duo's upcoming feature of Active Directory Defense, we can take a look and see that, why do we even care? It's kind of been, Active Directory's kind of been this, it's there, it's doing its thing. We don't need to babysit it. So we don't always go looking and take visibility on it. But as time has progressed forward, Active Directory can easily be hiding some service accounts that you've configured in the past, inactive accounts, overprivileged accounts, which results in lateral movement by bad actors, and then they can hide that way by moving around with those compromised credentials. And with Active Directory, you're involved with custom configuration, you into certain things. With Active Directory, you might have multiple domains running in your forest. We have legacy system integrations that still support only NTLM or maybe Kerberos, but a lot of NTLM still out there. Generations of admins and privileged accounts that are just hung on over time, temporary users of service accounts. And, again, based on Cisco Talos' incident response data, they've determined 44% of identity-based attacks targeted Active Directory, which almost half. So that's a pretty significant number there. So what are we addressing? Two things: visibility intelligence, which detects gaps or misconfigurations in complex Active Directory environments, including those risky, overprivileged, non-human or dormant or temporary accounts. And second, protection. So blocking unauthorized access to critical systems with direct MFA insertion into those legacy authentication flows. Those are two key components of Duo Active Directory Defense. Getting visibility with Cisco Identity Intelligence does the visibility part. And then feature that's coming out real soon is MFA protection for those legacy protocols. So perhaps your environment might look similar to this. We see it quite often. We still have the on-prem identity of Active Directory, but there's been some adoption to a cloud identity provider of some sort, whether it be Okta, Entra, or even Duo or some other cloud identity that's into all your modern-based applications. And those are supported over SAML and OIDC. But we still have down here with the legacy, we've got SSH and PowerShell, leveraging NTLM and Kerberos protocols as well. So being able to come in with a solution where we've got Cisco Identity Intelligence giving you visibility on what authentications are happening down here, what accounts are being used, what accounts are inactive. It's giving you a treasure trove of data to actually understand what's really there, give you the full visibility there. And then in being able to add in some MFA of some sort into these legacy protocols would be a huge improvement over today, where it's just not seen and the actors are moving around really in the dark. So they're able to hide really well. PowerShell and command line interfaces, they rely heavily on Kerberos and NTLM, primarily when performing remote management tasks or accessing networks resources. We've got Samba and CIFS file sharing. So if you have network share access going on in your environment, NTLM acts as a fallback for Kerberos. So that's a concern as well. And you've got legacy applications potentially, there's some enterprise resource planning applications, human resource applications that rely strictly on NTLM or Kerberos to function. especially if they were developed before the 2000s. So those are still kicking around. So, you know, how does this MFA insertion work, since these are legacy protocols that don't have like a web UI, right, for the user? Most of this is going to be triggered with just an automatic push to the Duo mobile app. Turn this off so this works. So yeah, Duo MFA for Kerberos and NTLM is a standard Duo push, and a phone call if a push is not available. That is a second option available for that. And then Duo command line protection is compatible with Duo verified push, that number matching on the app, but doesn't give you those extra options that you get with the universal prompt. So that's coming right around the corner. Just to give you kind of an idea of what that might look like in your environment. If you have a vCenter, vSphere environment, that still depends on NTLM authentication. User puts in their username and password, you click OK. While it's churning through, they get an automatic push to their device. And that's how the MFA involved in that legacy protocol to allow or deny that authentication. Any questions on Active Directory defense? All right. Maybe the moment you've been waiting for, maybe not. It's long overdue, but now identity security has gotten a lot of attention in a short space of time, and specifically in identity threat detection and response, ITDR for short. The Cisco Identity Intelligence team at Cisco actually helped Gartner define and promote this new category. And now we've seen a lot of both niche vendors and bigger players adopt it and really follow suit. But it's still just, you know, one piece of the big puzzle here. But at least we're seeing some traction out in the market now. And again, you can't detect what you cannot see, which means you can't respond and take care of those things, which is a critical component of NIST. So what does this currently look like today in a lot of environments? You know, we've got perhaps employee one is utilizing Google apps or their HR finance app, but each of those is hooked into a different IDP on the back end. But since they're using different IDPs across the board and maybe different employees coming in through Office with Enter ID on the back end, you know, this is the visibility you get. It's very separated and only in one spot per identity provider you're using. So how is Microsoft's IDTR supposed to learn about Okta and Google authentications? We also see this environment a lot where, you know, there's no second factor connected into, you know, one of the primary app spaces that an org is using, or the critical one is protected with the first factor by one MFA provider and the second one, or one identity store, and then the second factor by a different MFA provider. And then sometimes there's some MFA configured. I don't know how many of you have played around in Microsoft Entraland. How many of you enjoy actually configuring conditional access policies? I sure don't. They're a pain in the butt. So being able to manage that in a easy manner, it creates headaches for the admins. So yeah, we see a lot of incompleteness in the Enter ID space as well. So wouldn't it be nice to get some visibility on all of that? So with Cisco Identity Intelligence, we can actually hook into all your identity providers. We can hook into any HR information systems we may have that support API calls. If you have a device manager that supports an API, we can hook into applications like these. And then Identity Intelligence also connects into some threat feeds to marry all this together, because now we're getting static data from users, groups, apps, devices, all that jazz. And then events that are happening out in the wild gives us clear view on posture management, things that don't have MFA, things that are dormant, accounts that are dormant, accounts that are over privileged, a unified view to kind of see all that in one spot. Really nice, all of those users and devices, and enables you to do some detection and response, seeing the techniques and procedure detection there on screen with the ability for admins to start monitoring identity as a whole. Empowered with that, you can actually take some action. You can hook in through API to whatever service manager you're using, like ServiceNow or similar products. You could trigger alerts in Teams chats or whatever instant messaging platform you're using internally to support your org. And then being empowered with that data, you can now go and mitigate and remediate those issues that are uncovered. So the identity threat landscape is rapidly evolving, and trusted identity providers have fallen under attack. According to Verizon's 2023 data breach report, 74% of breaches involved the human element. Other solutions aren't solving the problem, so identify these threats now with Cisco's ITDR health check. Out of this report, you'll get IAM posture evaluation to review what where you have no or weak MFA, dormant accounts, overprivileged users, and more. Identity insight, give a unified view of all identities with detailed activity and device mappings. Threat detection, visibility and identity-related attacks. Compliance monitoring, if you're under any sort of compliance like PCI, NIST, or CIS, or others, you can actually see that data and actually line it up if you're trying to be compliant with those requirements, and make sure you're checking those boxes, or you know the areas where you need to make some changes and mitigate. And then license usage, so you can kind of see what's being idly used that's consuming a license, so that way you can actually save some costs and remove those licensing costs on things that really aren't being used. So this is kind of an example of what it would look like after you get your identity security assessment all squared away. It's a nice report. It'll come with an executive summary, some general results, you know, just to kind of give you a personalized perspective on how you're doing on your identity security posture. They'll give you the numbers that you can drill further down into, how many administrators you have, users with license that have never logged in, so you can save costs there, some service accounts, you know, how many you have those, and how many are actually being used. So in this instance, there are 258, but only 12 are actively being used, so that's a concern. Just some key criteria here that will come out of the report. It's more about MFA adoption, you know, seeing where either no MFA is being adopted or weak authentication methods are being used, so you can figure out a game plan to get all your users to a strong MFA enrollment. And just getting better visibility out on, you know, what attacks might be happening in your environment. Seeing where people might be using personal VPNs to access things that could be a legitimate user or a malicious actor, but it would be useful information to know when those VPNs are being used and which outside access attack vectors are being leveraged in your environment to take some action on them. And it'll give you, you know, a prioritized list of some recommendations to take specific to your org once you get your report. So as a final wrap up to the identity security assessment, what it kind of looks like, you'll request your identity security assessment through Duo, the Duo team, and we can also assist with this, get your APIs configured so we're feeding that data into Cisco identity intelligence to be able to create this report for you. Then we'll check in with you a few days later, make sure those integrations are operational, that the data that's coming in is what's expected to be seen, and that we're actually getting that data to get that visibility and give you the report. So after a couple of weeks of observing what's happening in your environment, that report will be generated, and Duo and our team here at CVE Tech will follow up with you and review that report and see what next steps you'd like to take with that report. So the rest I have for you is just, you know, what Duo is from a general overview. Easy way to start your MFA journey, if you haven't already, is to focus on remote access VPN. That's a very heavily attacked vector right now. If you have multi-cloud presence, focusing there as well as an initial stage, and then your productivity apps, email, Microsoft, Google, workspace if you're using that. Getting all those protected with some MFA is kind of your stepping stone to then jump into the other use cases that we can start closing that gap of visibility and protection across. all
And is there
vectors.
any gaps or any application that it's not there yet, or that you think is missing that's coming, or?
I mean, I'm not too tied into what's kind of missing, but I imagine it would be API dependent and, you know, what we're kind of losing connectivity on. A lot of the legacy stuff, you know, it's hard to really put stuff in there. So that's what makes Active Directory Defense so exciting, is we can actually do some MFA when NTLM and Kerberos are being used, because those protocols are still being used very heavily in on-prem environments that are relying on AD today. So that's going to really close the gap down. I would say it's going to completely close it, but I have to check with the Duo team to see where they feel the current gaps are. We can do that after this meeting if you want. Check in with them. So Duo can do passwordless, MFA, SSO, trusted endpoints. I never really touched on that, but I meant to mention it. Trusted endpoints is built in on every tier of Duo. That's that check to say this device is either joined our domain or enrolled and managed by our MDM solution. You can add that check in at any point with authentications that support the universal prompt on the website. Make sure it's one of your devices that's authenticating into that system. So if you want your identity security assessment, this is the URL for it. I created a QR code for you if you want to pull it up on your phone. And then at any time, if you ever just want to kick the tires on Cisco Duo and integrate it with a few apps to see how or if it's going to work well for you, signup.duo.com. You just put in your information there and you get a full-blown Duo account for 30 days to test it out and see how it works. That's all I got, pretty much. Do you have any questions?
What's the lift? You get a free account, you want to integrate to your VPN authentication. How long does that take?
It kind of depends on the VPN headend that you're using, what platform you're using for VPN, but Duo has some extensive step-by-step documentation. It's one of the best I've ever seen. It'll guide you through the whole process, start to finish. Usually I can get remote access VPN set up in less than a day, just on the side of your regular VPN setup.
And I bet if you ask Rob or any of your CVE account managers very nicely, they can have Trent help you do that.
The Duo team is also very helpful, but yeah, I love stepping in and helping as well. Do you have a question?
Yeah, so we use the Duo for Windows Logon app currently. Does the Duo desktop replace that?
No.
That's two separate.
The Duo desktop app is very lightweight, but he's the one that's gathering like the device profiling information. So another thing with Duo that we like to push, especially when customers come to us and say, we want to do posture at authentication time. And, you know, you can install a posture agent that, you know, is very focused on making sure, you know, operating system's up to date. You've got certain softwares running, firewalls enabled, all that jazz. It's a lot easier, excuse me. It's a lot easier with Duo and the Duo desktop app because it takes care of the basic checks of what operating system bill you're on, if the firewall is enabled, if the hard drive is encrypted, and if the admin password is set. And then he also reports in, well, Duo actually senses, you know, with the user agents on web browsers to see what version of Chrome or Firefox they're using. You can build policy around all of those items with Duo. So you could say, all right, since Windows 10 is now end of support by Microsoft, we want to make sure that everybody that's coming into our protected apps is on Windows 11 and not on Windows 10 anymore, you can create a policy in Duo. As long as that Duo desktop app is installed, you'll get that visibility to say, okay, we still have, 40% of the users logging in on a Windows 10 machine. Let's focus on them and help them get upgraded or refreshed to get them on the right operating system. And then you can put enforcement into that too with Duo and say, we're going to close the door on any operating system version that is no longer supported at all by the manufacturer. It's very easy and quick to set that up in Duo. So not only do you get visibility on what's really out there and accessing your apps, just so you to be aware, oh yeah, we do have some Windows 8 still accessing this app, or an old version of Mac OS still accessing this application. You can have that visibility to actually take some action on it really easily with Duo and then enforce it whichever way you want. And then the Duo desktop app will help the user step through remediation. Because if it's a browser check that's failing because they haven't installed a browser version in the last 90 days, then it'll prompt them, hey, you need to go update now, and then step them through on how to do it. So we can get that updated real quick.
What Duo tier do you need for the passwordless?
You need the Advantage tier. Most of the things I covered today, the Duo Advantage tier includes it all. And that's where most of our customers end up. And honestly, like getting Entra's MFA versus Duo Essentials, you're not getting really the power of Duo that we showcased today in a comparative manner. So I would always push you towards Advantage. The Premier, not really needed except in a couple of particular use cases. One being if you wanted to host your own kind of zero trust web reverse proxy portal on-prem, that's part of the Premier. But usually our customers have some other SASE solution that they're leveraging to be that front. So it's not that way. You're not the ones having to maintain that VM and your DMZ and making sure it's up to date, because now it's public facing, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing is, if you have a particular anti-malware agent that you wanted to make sure and enforce policy that that agent is specifically running on that endpoint on authentication time, that's part of the Premier as well. All the other checks like operating system, firewall enabled, if their browser's up to date, that's all part of Advantage. Any other questions?
I mean, I saw that you had like the Citrix is on there. Do you know, is that specific? Does that work with like the singular password list? Does that work and the desktop app? Does that work with Citrix virtual desktops, or is that Citrix virtual applications, or can it do both, or do you know there's a limitation on that?
I'm not too familiar with Citrix platform. Again, it all comes down to protocol for like, if you're doing it through a web browser, that would likely be SAML based. So Citrix supports SAML, but
Well, just where we got like, we've got like 8 people all logged into the same server essentially, that's going to have the desktop agent installed. It's going to be able to actually identify them, or is it going to not be able to? That's we've just had that issue with other platforms. So we'll be able to identify the individual users as they're signed in, versus is it going to go, yep, there's a lot of users here and I'm confused as to which one's which.
I guess it depends on if Citrix, again, I'm not too familiar with that platform, but it depends on if like that login is actually loading that specific user's account on the operating system level.
Yeah.
That's where the Duo desktop would pick that up.
Because it shows all of them on the desktop.
But
that's why as I'm curious, is it actually going to be able to differentiate between all of their different traffic, or is it going to be confused because other platforms are confused?
Right. But if they launch like a web browser and then they're prompted with, the authentication prompt there, then obviously they're going to be identified as that particular user getting into that app.
Yeah. So it might be
Part of the Windows session.
So,
yeah, it might
User session.
but yeah, like For me, I'd be going to the Duo docs specifically around Citrix and seeing what integrations there are there. So yeah, they have a few integration guides here. So Citrix Access Gateway, the iframe has been end of support. Okay, so this whole thing's gone, I guess. So it's the web interface. So is this like the interface you're used to at all? The web interface client? Or is that not one you're using? And then there's Citrix Workspace.
I'll take that and see what
They're not really giving me a
see if
UI
it
on their
matches
end
with
of what it
ours.
looks like. Yeah, if it's their workspace platform, then it's SSO with SAML. Yeah, basically if it's a web interface as the entry point, usually most vendors are adopting SAML in that space, so you can actually do an MFA provider based authentication with SSO. Any other questions? So, appreciate you coming out. It's been
Thank
great
you.
to have you, and hopefully enlighten you in some area.